Hudson's Bay Company, founded in 1670 and a fur trading business for most of its history, is the oldest company in North America. Today, it has 30,000 employees and owns and operates nearly 239 department stores in Canada and the United States, while owning or controlling approximately 3.7 million square meters of gross leasable real estate. While the company's own website does acknowledge the organization's questionable business practices during its colonial past, is there perhaps another, more important dimension to this origin story that the official historians are deliberately leaving out? In a mainstream context, much of the material which follows would tend to be presented as a kind of historical trivia of some distant past, relevant only for the purposes of curiosity or nostalgia. That was then, this is now, look at where we came from, look at how much we've changed. This is not the case here. As always, only by understanding where our systems come from and the mechanisms of control which are involved can we recognize our own predicament and identify how those same mechanisms are in fact still in place today. I'm not referring to some kind of gradual evolution of older systems into what we see around us, but rather the invisible continuance of an ancient system maintained into the modern world in a disguised form. In a later episode, we'll look into how this is quite literally and provably the case. For now, throughout the following narratives, look for patterns in terms of agreement, consent, and commerce. Likewise, consider where benefits and conveniences have been accepted, as well as the costs that had to be paid. You will also notice the pervasive role played by bloodlines, from royals to nobles, and in particular, the merchant class. With all of that in mind, we can begin. The story we are told begins with two French merchants in the mid-1800s who had been successfully trading with the original inhabitants on the Canadian landmass in what was known at the time as New France. These men, while living amongst and apparently fraternizing with the locals, would trade European manufactured goods like knives, kettles, beads, needles, and blankets for local furs, apparently very consensually, and indirectly connecting in to an existing local trade network that had already been in operation for hundreds of years. As the story goes, these men heard from Cree locals about a great untapped area rich in beaver furs located on the interior around what we now know as Hudson's Bay. Eager to meet the growing demand in Europe for felt hats made from beaver furs, they set about to seek financing and ships. When the governor of New France refused to grant the pair permission to scout the territory, they decided to try their luck with the British, who were yet to establish themselves in the region. After some successful test runs funded by London investors, the two men linked up with Prince Rupert of the Rhine in order to help organize a royal charter. Rupert had an extensive military background and had operated as a royalist privateer or licensed pirate in the Caribbean. As a privateer, his letters of marque had given him royal permission to attack and capture vessels of any nation at war with the issuer, to raid the contents, and then split the proceeds with the crown. And so, Rupert took the Frenchman's business plan to his cousin, King Charles II, and in 1668, a British expedition set off. Though one of the two ships was forced to turn back, The other returned successfully with a cargo full of fur, and the royal charter was granted. The Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson's Bay was incorporated, and a commercial monopoly granted over the region drained by all the rivers and streams flowing into the Hudson's Bay in the northern part of present-day Canada. This land was named Rupert's Land, after Prince Rupert, who became its first governor. In exchange for this perpetual charter and monopoly over almost 4 million square kilometres of land, the adventurers had to return back to Charles on an annual basis, and whenever any of his heirs or successors entered the territory, a total of 2 elks and 2 black beavers. The company, its name later simplified to just the Hudson's Bay Company, had a total monopoly over all commerce in this region. That meant that any European settler or merchant who wanted to pull a fish out of a river, catch a beaver, or do any business with the locals had to go through the Hudson's Bay Company and pay for the privilege. Pains, penalties, and punishments could be imposed upon all offenders as shall seem necessary, requisite, or convenient for the good government of the company, and for the advancement and continuance of trade, traffic, and plantations, as long as these punishments were considered reasonable and not contrary or repugnant to the customs of this our realm. The Europeans were not allowed to visit, haunt, frequent, or trade in any of the company's territories without paying for a license and gaining permission. Contravention of this would result in the confiscation of all goods and merchandise, as well as whatever other possessions they had with them, including their ships, with half of the proceeds going to the company and the other half going back to the Crown. Offenders were imprisoned on a minimum of £1,000 bond, while other appropriate punishments were determined and meted out, after which they were banned indefinitely from trading into any company territories. Offenders could also be disfranchised, that is, removed from the corporation and deprived of their rights, and even deported back to England for further punishment. Though the charter was technically the granting of a monopoly over the Europeans, since there were no other foreigners for the locals to deal with in the area, it was an effective monopoly over them also. But how then was this corporation, practically speaking, able to enforce a monopoly of this scale? Though Prince Rupert was the company governor, he never actually set foot in North America, and Charles Bailey, as the overseas governor, ran Rupert's Land in his stead. Through Bailey, Rupert, with his military experience and privateer background, could now apply his talents for legal piracy on land. The Hudson's Bay Company had military, warships, forts, and courts. All these institutions, which we ordinarily associate with being arms of a government of a country or nation state, were being operated commercially by a corporation. The corporation, as long as its rules didn't contradict the common law, was authorized to use whatever force was necessary to impose its company policy on the population at large on all matters. The Hudson's Bay Company ruled the land we now consider to be the bulk of Canada for over 200 years. That's longer than the constitutional monarchy which, so we are told, governs the region today. In contrast to today, Throughout the 17 and 1800s, the average man and woman living in Rupert's Land understood that they were being governed by a corporation. That's not to say they liked it. They would shoot at and attack the Hudson's Bay forts to demonstrate that fact, but they were aware of who was ruling them. As opposed to the French approach, where the merchants would live with and somewhat integrate with the locals while trading, the British, through the Hudson's Bay Company, established a more formal network of trading posts throughout the region. Over its history, including rivals it would later absorb, the number of posts would reach almost 500. Rather than the direct trading or bartering of local furs for European manufactured items, which had occurred somewhat organically over the previous 100 years in other areas, the company introduced a more regulated system with consistent pricing. At the end of a season, groups of indigenous trappers, or a local representative, would bring pelts to one of the many Hudson's Bay trading posts. These factories were run by a factor, that is, a person acting as a mercantile agent and selling goods which were consigned to him on a commission basis. The trappers would be issued standardized brass tokens for the agreed-upon value of their catch. These tokens were marked in fractional denominations, with the largest coin, a made beaver, being the value of a prime male adult pelt having been worn in for a year by a local and ready for processing. As an example, 2 otter pelts might equal 1 made beaver. After being furnished with their made beaver tokens, the trappers were then able to spend them in stores on manufactured items, or exchange the tokens with other locals, or settlers who may also want the tokens to buy goods or to perhaps pay fines. Of course, with access to the European market, the company could take a beaver pelt that a local trapper was paid a single metal axe head for and use that pelt to buy dozens of metal axe heads back home in England. Inequality and geographical arbitrage aside, this arrangement was apparently consensual trade that the locals were only too happy to participate in. In addition to these brass tokens, the Hudson's Bay Company also later issued their own paper money. These promissory notes, which were denominated in quantities of silver, were printed in London and issued at York Factory in Rupert's Land. So, for example, if a trapper brought in a fur for sale, or performed manual labour, building a fort, or rendered any other service to the company, the organisation would pay him at one of the many trading posts in a piece of paper which was redeemable for silver. Sounds fair enough. The catch was, when he wanted to collect on that physical silver, he needed to go to York Factory, a journey which for a rural trapper using the transportation of the time, canoe, horse or foot, might have taken weeks over icy, rugged terrain. If he had to cross the Rocky Mountains, it could have taken months. But it gets worse. When he actually arrived in York Factory and presented the note, he would be given yet another piece of paper, this time a bill of exchange, which needed to be collected upon at the Hudson's Bay Company office in London, England. Assuming he then paid for a ticket, got on a ship and crossed the Atlantic, sailing for 3 or 4 weeks, the company's London office was then entitled to make him wait a further 60 days before actually handing over the silver. How many rural fur trappers then would have had the time or funds to travel for over 3 months without working and incurring expenses in order to do this. And why would they? In Rupert's Land, the Hudson's Bay Company was the only game in town, and people could effectively spend these promissory notes amongst each other locally as needed. As a result, the company could feel quite comfortable printing and spending these promissory notes indefinitely, confident that only a tiny proportion of them would ever realistically be collected upon. The company then was paying their local fur suppliers with practically uncollectible paper promises, all the while selling those same furs to wealthy customers in London for hard silver. And this humongous scam, operating on a countrywide scale, lasted for hundreds of years. The Hudson's Bay Company is just one example of this kind of operation. Others include the British East India Company, which famously traded in Indian textiles and Chinese tea. The Dutch East India Company, modelled on the British, which predominantly traded in spices. The Virginia Company, which traded in tobacco, timber, and cash crops, such as cotton from the east coast of America. And the Royal African Company, which traded for gold, silver, and ivory out of the West African coast. All of these companies also traded in people, and of course, all of this under royal charter. To get a sense of scale, we're told the British East India Company at its peak was the largest company in the world and had 260,000 soldiers, which was twice the size of the British Army at the time. While these British merchants during the early 19th century were profiting immensely from the lucrative trade of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, they had a problem. The Chinese were not interested in British goods and instead insisted on payment for theirs in silver, an arrangement which was quickly depleting the British reserves. The East India Company's solution to this balance of trade problem was to take opium from their operations in India and illegally import it into China, demanding payment in silver. They then used this silver to buy tea and other Chinese goods. This approach was supposedly so effective that the sale of Indian opium to China in 1839 paid for the entire British tea trade for that year. The Chinese rulers, however, understandably not happy with millions of their subjects becoming addicted to opium, took a stand against the company and confiscated opium stocks for destruction. From this conflict, the First Opium War began, which ultimately resulted in the capitulation of the Chinese to British trade demands. It's not so hard to see then that these corporations were in effect a vehicle for European monarchs to exert aggressive foreign policy. These organizations acted as powerful engines of geopolitical control, fueled by trade, which often started quite consensually, before later transforming into something that seemed very different. Though the British and Dutch were frontrunners in operating corporations of this nature and scale, seemingly every significant European royal family had at least one company operating out in the world in their stead and applying a somewhat similar approach. If we look around the world at the behavior of these European trading companies, though there are exceptions, a rough pattern or standard operating procedure tends to emerge. First, small initial expeditions arrive at new lands with European manufactured goods, which are then exchanged willingly by the inhabitants for their local resources and products. After all, with such small parties isolated and across the world on foreign soil, why would they begin interactions any differently? The danger of premature aggression was a lesson already well learned. So this consensual trade develops for a time until some sort of treaty or agreement is signed by representatives, often with these locals not entirely understanding what was being agreed to, or even conceiving that certain things like land actually could be owned, let alone signed away. Regardless, trade continues and expands, with locals becoming increasingly reliant on these foreign manufactured products. This may sound familiar. Over time, European culture, rules and systems are further introduced, including tokens and other forms of money or money substitutes, and the locals, especially second-generation mixed children of settlers and the indigenous, work within these systems and develop or integrate them further. From here, the infrastructure, incentives and mechanisms are now in place to ruthlessly enforce the terms of these early agreements, now by violent means if necessary. Let's look at the Nanfan Treaty from 1701, which the Government of Canada marks as the British Crown's first year of treaties with Indigenous groups in the British colonies of North America. The agreement, in broad strokes, appears to indicate the following. The chiefs of the Five Nations recall a bloody war that their ancestors had with another local group, the Seven Nations of Indians, who they conquered and drove from the area 80 years prior. The chiefs claim that for the subsequent 60 years, they were the sole masters of the land and hunted in the area without interference, but that in the last 20 years, the remnant of those Seven Nations, who had been previously expelled, had returned and were disturbing their hunting. The chiefs claim that fighting had been ongoing since, and that they would have beaten the returning men had their enemies not been assisted by the French, who had sent a considerable force to build a fort in the area. Thus, these men, in order to avoid being deprived of their ability to survive and being brought into perpetual bondage and slavery, volunteered to contractually surrender their lands to the British, that is, forever all the right, title and interest and claim and demand whatsoever would pass to the King of England, in exchange for these men and their descendants retaining the right to hunt freely in the region. Interestingly, this first year of treaties apparently occurred 31 years after the Hudson's Bay Company was granted their charter. So, what was happening in the interim? Well, it appears that prior to this Nanfan Treaty, these locals had lived peaceably and quietly with the people of Albany for 80 years after making a firm league and covenant chain with these Christians. So, seemingly this previous period of goodwill apparently gave them the confidence to trust this new treaty that they were now entering into. Despite many assuming that treaties like these are quaint leftover documents, unenforceable by the descendants of the weaker party, in reality, these agreements appear to still be in play today. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 came following the 7 Years' War, where King George claimed territory in North America from the French. Despite having just pushed out the French from the area, this proclamation specifically states that the Aboriginal title has existed and continues to exist, and that all land would be considered Aboriginal land until ceded by treaty. Since no law has overruled it, that same royal proclamation appears to hold. And in fact, Section 35 of the so-called Constitution Act from 1982 recognises and reaffirms those same Aboriginal rights. Note that the document doesn't claim to create the rights, but rather recognises a relationship that already existed. Many Indigenous today still understand their situation as a nation-to-nation relationship between themselves and the British rulers, as it was in the beginning and bound by international law. So, if the Crown has not extinguished these existing rights and title, as were negotiated by treaty, then what happened? Well, in simplified terms, these Indigenous people were offered benefits and status in exchange for the acceptance of a more restricted situation, where those privileges could then be modified with new terms and conditions, or even withdrawn at the monarch's discretion. Despite all this, it does seem that access to the original contract is still available to those who can remember who they are and stand. Of course, there has been a massive and sustained effort expended over a long period of time in an attempt to make these people forget. Looking back at the Nanfan Treaty, there is something eerily familiar about the notion of a population being offered benefits, comforts, and status in exchange for the participation in a new system. Though coercion may have been involved, it does appear to be based on a foundation of consent, with the locals ultimately agreeing to this arrangement and inviting it in. Normally, when we see images like this, it's tempting to assume we're looking at control being exerted by force, or by threats of force, backed by superior technology or weaponry. But is that really what this is? What if these men here doing physical labor and being ordered around by Europeans didn't need to be coerced? What if they showed up to these beaches willingly, in order to collect tokens, which they could then use to buy certain manufactured goods, as opposed to the necessities which were already being provided by nature for free? This may be starting to sound familiar. When put into those terms, you might say, what's wrong with people voluntarily entering into agreements to give their labor in exchange for valuable compensation? Well, arguably nothing. Except, of course, if that valuable compensation turns out to be a paper promise, created out of nothing and connected to nothing. These locals, who at one stage were getting paid for their goods and labor with European goods in kind, were now being paid for their efforts in tokens. And this is where the line between paid worker and slave starts to get blurry. If the issuer of a currency, backed by nothing, is also spending it, are they really paying for anything? Or, by handing it over, are they merely, in a sense, directing the recipient to collect that value from someone else's efforts, who is also reliant on that currency? For example, if I printed a $100 bill out of my inkjet printer, and then used it to buy a stack of sandwiches from the corner store, I haven't really paid the lady for the sandwiches. Assuming she accepts the note, I've really just indirectly told her to go and collect that $100 of value from someone else. If able to operate unmolested, with my inkjet printer and a comparatively small group of cohorts, we could walk around town and quite quickly spend our way into key positions of ownership, influence, and control. Therefore, one can imagine that with the momentum and infrastructure in place to legitimately counterfeit en masse, comes the ability to enslave entire populations, technically speaking, by consent. That is, of course, until a day comes that those populations decide they've had enough.